What's the most extreme thing your mother made you wear? My mom laced me into a steel corset and tightened it until I couldn't breathe because she said our family's men had 18-inch waists for 5 generations and I wouldn't be the one to break tradition. It was my 8th birthday. Instead of cake and presents, Mom led me to her study where Dad stood in the corner, his own waist cinched so tight he looked like someone had folded him in half. "Time to start your training," she said. The steel bones bit into my ribs as she yanked the laces. I tried to scream but couldn't get enough air. "Beauty requires sacrifice," she said, knotting it so tight my vision went spotty. That first day I puked twice from the pressure. My stomach was squished to nothing like someone had stepped on a juice box. Mom gave me protein shakes to sip through straws, maybe 4 ahs at a time. Regular breathing was impossible, so I had to pant like a dog in summer heat. My ribs felt like someone was slowly pushing them through my lungs. Dad watched from his chair, hands folded over his own crushed middle, cinched down to the size of a 2-liter soda bottle. My brothers Victor and Elias had been training for years. Victor's waist at 14 was smaller than my leg. Elias's at 16 wasn't much bigger. They moved like broken robots, couldn't bend over to tie their shoes or twist to look behind them. During dinner, they'd sit super straight, faces gray from no oxygen, eating maybe 3 bites while Mom measured their waists between courses. "Victor, you've expanded a 1/4 inch. No food tomorrow." Other kids at school played tag while I leaned on walls trying not to pass out. Gym class? Forget it. Mom got me excused with fake medical notes. The real medical issue was my liver getting shoved up into my rib cage. The nurse found me unconscious in the bathroom once and wanted to call 911, but Mom showed up and convinced her I just had anxiety. Yeah, anxiety about my organs getting rearranged like furniture. By 10, Mom decided I needed a serious training corset. This device had twice the steel bones and was shaped to basically fold me in half. She'd hang me from this pull-up bar to stretch my spine while she yanked the laces. I'd black out every time, but she'd splash water on my face to wake me up. "Your great-grandfather achieved 16 in by your age," she'd say. 16 in. I could fit both my hands around that with fingers overlapping. The damage showed up fast. I couldn't digest anything because my stomach was crushed flat. My body just stopped growing at 11, like it gave up on becoming a man. My spine curved into an S shape from the pressure. My ribs started overlapping in front, poking through my skin like I was turning inside out. When I told Dad about the stabbing pains, he just stared at me with dead eyes and whispered, "It never stops hurting. 20 years and it never stops." But he didn't help me. All he said was that if I stopped my training, I'd never be beautiful. And I was so brainwashed I thought that was all that mattered. Victor's body gave up first. At 18, his liver quit from being squeezed for 10 years. The doctor said his organs looked like they'd been in a car accident. Mom called the doctor an idiot and took Victor home, made him keep wearing the corset while he turned yellow and coughed blood. "Your wedding is in 3 months, she kept saying. "Your wife expects perfection." That's when I realized this wasn't worth dying for. I tried to cut my corset off with kitchen shears, but the steel was too thick. Mom caught me and went ballistic. She got a new corset, tighter than before, with actual locks on it like I was a prisoner. She wore the keys on a chain around her neck. Then Elias's rib exploded during a tightening session. It sounded like stepping on a bag of chips. He dropped and started making these wet breathing sounds because the bone had punched into his lung. Mom kept pulling the laces while he was literally drowning in his own blood. "It'll heal in place," she said, like ribs were meant to be inside your lungs. Dad finally called 911 when Elias's lips went blue, but Mom made him lie about it being a fall. When Elias was still in the hospital, Mom called a family meeting. Victor was basically dying on the couch and Dad was crying silently in his chair. Mom pulled out this ancient corset made of ivory and silk. 12 in, she said, holding it up like the Holy Grail. "Your great-great-grandfather wore this for 50 years. It was barely bigger around than a baseball. You could fit it in one hand." She turned to me with that torture device, and I knew she was going to try to achieve her sick dream through my body. 5 generations of men crushed into impossible shapes, and I was the last chance. She approached with that ivory nightmare talking about honor and legacy. "Victor is dying and Elias is broken," she said, like it was their fault, "but you can still be perfect." Mom held up that antique torture device, smaller than my neck, and smiled at me like she was giving me a gift instead of a death sentence. Mom took a step toward me, holding that ivory corset in both hands like it was some kind of prize. Her eyes were bright and excited in a way that made my stomach twist even worse than the steel already crushing it. The corset looked impossible, way smaller than anything a person could actually wear and still breathe. I could see Victor on the couch behind Mom, his skin yellow and his breathing shallow, literally dying from what she'd done to his body for 10 years. Elias was in the hospital with a rib through his lung, and she wanted to do something even worse to me. My vision got narrow and focused on just that tiny circle of silk and bone, and I knew with total clarity that if she got that thing on me, I would die. Not eventually, not in a few years, but soon, maybe in days or weeks. My body couldn't take being crushed down to 12 in. I needed to do something right now, or I'd end up like my brothers. I made a fast decision that staying alive mattered more than being obedient. I blurted out that I needed the bathroom immediately, or I'd have an accident right there on the floor. floor. My voice came out high and panicky, but that probably helped sell it. Mom's face twisted up with disgust because she hated when anyone mentioned normal body stuff. She waved her hand at me like she was shooing away a fly and told me I had 2 minutes before we continued my training. 2 minutes. That was all the time I had to figure out how to save myself. I moved as fast as I could toward the bathroom, my ribs screaming with each step because the current corset was already so tight I could barely get air. In the bathroom, I locked the door with hands that shook so bad I almost couldn't turn the little button. I stared at my reflection in the mirror and saw my own gray face staring back. But I also saw Victor's yellow skin and Elias's blue lips like they were superimposed over my features, showing me exactly what my future looked like. The memory of Elias's rib crunching played in my head on repeat, that wet cracking sound like stepping on a bag of chips. He dropped to the floor making these horrible breathing noises because the bone had punctured straight into his lung. Mom had kept pulling the laces anyway, and Victor was dying right now in the other room while she talked about putting me in something even worse. My brother's destroyed bodies were showing me my own future unless I did something right this second. I couldn't wait or hope things would get better. I needed to act now. I grabbed the cheap disposable razor from the shower and carefully slid it up my sleeve where it would stay hidden. Then I tucked my phone into my waistband where the bulky sweatshirt covered the outline. My hands were steadier than I expected as I planned out what came next. I needed to make this abuse visible to someone who had the power to stop it. I needed witnesses. I needed evidence. The phone and razor were my tools for creating that. When I came back to the study, Mom immediately started the tightening process with the current corset. She yanked the laces so hard that black spots swam across my vision, and I couldn't get enough air to scream. My ribs compressed inward, and I felt them shifting in ways ribs shouldn't shift. I focused on keeping the razor and phone hidden while I scanned the room for anything else that could serve as evidence later. There were the old journals on the shelf that documented generations of this sick tradition. There was the ivory corset sitting on Mom's desk. There was Victor dying on the couch. Everything in this room was evidence of what she'd done to us. Dad sat in his chair by the window, with his own waist crushed down to nothing. His hands were folded over his middle, and he watched with those dead eyes that hadn't shown real emotion in years. He'd been doing this for 20 years, and it had killed something inside him. His vacant face told me everything I needed to know about whether help would come from inside this house. He wasn't going to save me. He wasn't going to save any of us. I stopped looking at him for rescue I'd never get. During a brief moment when Mom turned to grab more lacing material from her desk, I angled my phone carefully and pressed the record button. The phone stayed hidden in my waistband, but the microphone was active now, capturing everything. Mom launched into her familiar speech about how beauty requires sacrifice and how our family's men have always understood their duty to maintain the legacy. She talked about the 12-in standard and how I was the last hope for achieving it since Victor was dying and Elias was broken. Her voice was calm and certain, like she genuinely believed crushing her sons into impossible shapes was something noble. The recording captured every word about tradition and perfection and the ivory corset that would make me the ultimate achievement of 5 generations. I kept my face blank and my breathing as steady as possible while the phone documented her abuse in her own words. The pressure in my ribs became unbearable and I leaned over to vomit into the trash can beside the desk. My stomach was crushed too flat to hold anything, so only bile came up, burning my throat. Mom actually smiled when she saw me throw up. She said this was progress, that my body was learning to need less space. The casual way she framed my suffering as some kind of achievement made rage burn through the panic. She was proud of making me vomit. She thought destroying my body was a good thing. As Mom continued tightening the laces, I realized something important. If I couldn't stop what was happening right now in this moment, I could at least make sure it got reported at the school tomorrow. Teachers were mandatory reporters. If I collapsed somewhere public where witnesses could see the locked corset I couldn't remove myself, someone would have to call for help. The school nurse had already found me unconscious once. If it happened again with visible proof of what Mom was doing, she'd have to report it. I needed to collapse somewhere with lots of people around who would see and call 911. Somewhere with witnesses who couldn't be talked out of helping like Dad had been. Somewhere Mom couldn't control the situation. My heart dropped into my crushed stomach when Mom announced that I'd be staying home from the school tomorrow, so she could monitor my adjustment to the more extreme training. She was cutting off my access to outside witnesses before I could use them. She was going to isolate me completely, so nobody could see what she was doing. I needed to force a public crisis before she could lock me in this house. That meant I had to act tonight or tomorrow morning at the latest. I couldn't wait for school. I needed witnesses now. After Mom finally finished and left me crumpled on the study floor, I stayed there for maybe 20 minutes just trying to get enough air into my crushed lungs. The steel bit into my ribs with every shallow breath. My vision kept going gray at the edges from lack of oxygen. When I could finally move without blacking out, I crawled to my bedroom and waited until I heard Mom's office door close downstairs and Dad's footsteps heading to the kitchen. The house settled into its usual quiet, that awful silence where everyone pretends everything is normal. I pulled the razor from where I'd hidden it up my sleeve and tucked it under my mattress where Mom wouldn't find it during her random room check. checks. My phone showed 67% battery, so I plugged it in to charge overnight. The audio recording was still saved in my files. Mom's voice talking about sacrifice and the 12-in corset and how I was the last hope for the family legacy. Tomorrow, I needed to make this visible. Tomorrow, I needed witnesses who couldn't be talked out of helping. The grocery store plan formed in my head as I lay there staring at the ceiling. Lots of people, security cameras, public space where Mom couldn't control what happened. If I collapsed there with the locked corset visible, someone would call 911 before Mom could stop them. Dad always did the shopping on Saturday afternoon when the store was busiest. I just needed to convince him to take me along. The next afternoon, I found Dad in the kitchen, measuring out protein powder for my next shake. My stomach was too crushed to hold real food anymore, so these shakes were basically my only nutrition. I made my voice sound casual when I told him we were almost out of the powder, and Mom would be angry if we ran out. He looked at me with those dead eyes for a long moment before nodding slowly. We needed groceries anyway. The drive to the store took 15 minutes, and I spent the whole time checking that my phone was still in my pocket, with the recording still saved. Dad parked near the entrance and grabbed a cart. Inside the store was packed with Saturday shoppers, families with kids, couples doing their weekly shopping, exactly what I needed. We moved through the aisles slowly because I couldn't walk fast with the corset crushing my middle. The cereal aisle had the most people in it, plus I could see 2 security cameras mounted on the ceiling. Dad was reading a label on a box of granola when I stopped fighting. I just let my body do what it had been trying to do for hours, which was shut down from lack of oxygen. My legs went out from under me, and I dropped straight to the floor. The impact knocked what little air I had out of my lungs. I lay there on the cold tile gasping like a fish out of water, my mouth opening and closing, but not getting enough air to actually breathe. My shirt had ridden up when I fell, and the locked steel corset was completely visible, the padlock hanging off the front like some kind of sick jewelry. People crowded around immediately, their voices loud and worried over my head. Someone asked if I was okay. Someone else said to give me space. A woman in yoga pants pulled out her phone, and I heard her talking to 911 describing a teenage boy who collapsed and couldn't breathe. She mentioned the metal device around my waist. Another person asked Dad what was wrong with me. Why was I wearing that thing? Dad's voice came out shaky as he tried to explain that it was a back brace for my spine. Just a medical device, nothing to worry about. But I could hear the panic underneath his words, because this was exactly what Mom had warned him about, people seeing and asking questions. The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes according to the store's security footage that got pulled later. 2 of them, a man and a woman, both moving fast with their equipment bags. The woman knelt beside me and started checking my vital signs, while the man cleared people back to give them room to work. Her hands were gentle when she touched my neck to check my pulse. She asked me my name and if I could tell her what happened. I managed to whisper that I couldn't breathe right, that the corset was too tight. The male paramedic's eyes went to the padlock, and his face changed. He asked Dad directly why his son was wearing a locked medical restraint and who had the key. Dad tried to stick to the back brace story, but his voice was shaking worse now. The female paramedic was looking at where the steel pressed into my skin, at the blue tinge around my lips, at how my chest could barely move when I tried to inhale. She told her partner they needed to transport immediately. Dad started protesting that it wasn't necessary, that I just needed to rest, that we could take me home. The male paramedic cut him off and said clearly that they were making the medical decision to transport based on my restricted breathing and the concerning device. They got me onto a stretcher and started wheeling me toward the ambulance. That's when Mom appeared out of nowhere, her car screeching into the parking lot like she'd been monitoring Dad's phone or something. She tried to follow us into the ambulance, but the lead paramedic, the woman, blocked her with her body and told her firmly that she could follow in her own car, but she wasn't riding with us. It was the first time I'd ever seen anyone set a boundary with Mom and make it stick. Her face went red with rage, but the paramedic didn't back down. She climbed into the ambulance with me, and her partner closed the doors. As we pulled away, I could see Mom standing in the parking lot with Dad, both of them getting smaller in the window. The ER at County Hospital was bright and cold and smelled like cleaning chemicals. They wheeled me into a room, and a doctor came in almost immediately. His name tag said Dr. Mohammed Ramirez. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of calm face that made you think he'd seen everything. But when he examined the corset and saw how tight it was, how the steel was digging into my skin, how shallow my breathing was, his expression went carefully blank. That professional mask doctors use when they're seeing something really wrong but don't want to scare you. He asked me questions in a quiet voice, just him and me with the door closed. Did I feel safe at home? Was anyone hurting me? Could I tell him about the device and why it was locked? I was so tired of lying and hiding and pretending everything was fine. The words came out in a whisper because I didn't have enough air for anything louder. I told him my mom put it on me and wouldn't take it off. I told him my brothers were dying. I told him about Victor's liver and Elias's lung and the 12-in corset Mom wanted to use on me next. Dr. Ramirez listened to everything without interrupting, just nodding and making notes on his tablet. When I finished talking, Dr. Ramirez told me he needed to make some phone calls and he'd be right back. He stepped out into the hall hallway, but left the door cracked, and I could hear him talking to someone about non-accidental injury patterns and mandatory reporting requirements. His voice was calm but firm, the voice of someone who knew exactly what needed to happen next. Through the crack in the door, I saw Mom appear in the hallway trying to get to my room. She was talking loud about her rights as a parent and demanding to see me, but hospital security showed up within seconds, two big guys in uniforms who positioned themselves between Mom and my door. They told her she could wait in the family area, but she couldn't interfere with my medical care. Mom's face went purple, but the security guards didn't move, and eventually she had to back off. I could hear her still arguing as they walked her away from my room. The knot of fear in my chest loosened just a tiny bit because for the first time in my life, someone was stopping her. About an hour later, a woman came into my room and introduced herself as Elise Mendez from Child Protective Services. She had short dark hair and wore business clothes, a blazer and slacks that looked professional but not scary. She explained that the hospital had made a mandatory report and she needed to talk with me privately about what was happening at home. She asked if it was okay to record our conversation for documentation, and I said yes. Then I remembered my phone and the recording I'd made of Mom. My hands shook as I pulled it out and found the audio file. I told Elise about how I'd recorded Mom's whole speech about the 12-in corset and the family legacy and how I was supposed to be perfect. She listened to the entire recording, her face getting more and more grim as Mom's voice talked about sacrifice and tradition and how Victor and Elias were failures, but I could still achieve the standard. When it finished playing, Elise was quiet for a moment before she started making detailed notes about everything she'd heard. She asked me questions about Victor's liver failure and Elias's punctured lung, writing down every answer. Then she said something that made me start crying. She told me that with my permission, Dr. Ramirez could remove the locked corset using bolt cutters. Just cut it off. I didn't know that was even possible. I'd spent so long thinking I was trapped in it forever that only Mom had the power to remove it. But Elise was saying someone could just cut it off and I wouldn't have to wait for Mom's permission or convince her or anything. The relief hit me so hard I couldn't stop the tears. The next morning, I woke up in a hospital bed with the corset finally gone and my ribs still aching from where it had crushed them for so long. A different woman came into my room and introduced herself as Kamala Wade from the Victim Advocacy Office. She had warm brown skin and kind eyes, and she sat down next to my bed like she had all the time in the world. She explained her role in helping survivors of abuse with safety planning and court support. She outlined my options in clear, simple terms that didn't talk down to me or make assumptions about what I wanted. Emergency shelter placement where I could stay safe while the investigation happened, protective orders that would legally require Mom to stay away from me, court proceedings that would determine where I lived and what happened next. She asked me what I wanted, what felt safest to me, what my biggest fears were about each option. Nobody had ever asked me what I wanted before. Every decision about my body and my life had been made by Mom, with Dad silently going along with it. Having someone actually treat me like I had the right to make choices about my own safety felt weird and good and scary all at once. I told Kamala I didn't want to go home. I told her I was afraid Mom would find a way to finish what she started with that 12-in corset. She nodded like that made perfect sense and started writing down notes about shelter placement and protective orders. Later that day, a detective came to take my statement. His name was Owen Buckley, and he had gray hair and a tired face like he'd been doing this job for a long time. He set up a recording device on the table next to my hospital bed and explained that he needed me to describe what happened in factual terms, just the facts of what Mom did and when she did it and what the results were. I started with my 8th birthday, when Mom first put me in the steel corset. I described the progression over 10 years, how the corsets got tighter and more extreme, how my body started breaking down from the pressure. I told him about the medical damage to all 3 of us brothers, about Victor's failing liver and Elias's punctured lung and my own crushed organs and curved spine. I explained about the 12-in ivory corset and Mom's stated intention to achieve that standard through my body, no matter what it took. Detective Buckley listened to everything and asked clarifying questions about dates and specific incidents. He recorded details about the locks Mom put on my current corset, about the keys she wore around her neck, about how she'd isolated me from the school to prevent anyone from seeing what she was doing. The whole statement took almost 2 hours, and by the end, my voice was hoarse from talking. But Detective Buckley told me I'd done really well, that I'd given him exactly what he needed to move forward with the investigation. He said other people would be involved now, that this wasn't just on me anymore to fix or survive. The system was finally paying attention. The hospital scheduled me for a full imaging workup the next morning, and I spent the night in a regular room with monitors beeping every few minutes. A tech wheeled me down to radiology at 6 a.m. and ran x-rays, CT scans, and an MRI that took over an hour because they needed detailed pictures of my chest and spine. Back in my room 2 hours later, Dr. Ramirez came in with a tablet showing the scans and pulled up a chair next to my bed. He pointed to the images on the screen and explained what he was seeing in terms I could actually understand. My ribs had overlapped in the front where they should have stayed separate, creating a compressed cage that was pushing inward on my lungs. My spine had curved into an unnatural S shape from years of pressure, and several of my organs organs had shifted from their normal positions because there wasn't enough room for them anymore. My liver was sitting higher than it should be, pressed up against my diaphragm. My stomach had basically flattened out, and my intestines were bunched together in ways that explained why I couldn't digest food properly. Dr. Ramirez wrote down referrals for 3 different specialists and said I'd need long-term care to address all the damage. A gastroenterologist to work on my digestive issues, a lung doctor to help with my breathing problems, and an orthopedic specialist to figure out what could be done about my spine. He was honest that some of the damage might be permanent, but said we wouldn't know what was reversible until I'd been out of the corset for several months. Elise showed up around noon with a stack of folders and sat down in the chair Dr. Ramirez had used earlier. She told me that Elias was still in the hospital on a different floor, and CPS had placed something called a protective hold on him as a minor. That meant Mom couldn't check him out or take him home against medical advice, and the hospital had to keep him until the court said otherwise. Mom had already tried to interfere by calling the hospital's main line repeatedly, demanding to speak with Elias's doctors, and threatening to sue if they didn't release him immediately. Each phone call was documented as evidence that she couldn't prioritize her kid's safety over her control. I asked Elise what was happening with Victor, and she set down her pen with a careful expression. Victor was 18, so legally he was an adult who could refuse help even if he was dying. An advocate would try to reach out and offer medical care and safe housing, but they couldn't force him to accept it. The limitation made me want to scream because I knew Victor was getting worse every day at home, but Elise reminded me that I could only control my own choices and not my brother's decisions. It felt wrong to be getting help while Victor stayed trapped, but I also knew I couldn't save him if I went back. Detective Buckley called Elise's phone while we were talking, and she put him on speaker. He'd contacted my school that morning and spoken with the nurse, a woman named Hallie, who'd been checking on me since freshman year. Hallie filed a supplemental report documenting all the times she'd found me collapsed in the bathroom or leaning against walls in the hallway, barely able to breathe. Her records showed my gray skin tone during routine health checks and the difficulty I had taking full breaths when she listened to my lungs. She'd noted concerns about possible eating disorders or anxiety, but now the pattern made sense as ongoing abuse. Her documentation added more evidence that multiple people had seen signs something was seriously wrong. By my 3rd day in the hospital, Elise brought me paperwork for an emergency protective order and temporary removal from the home. She walked me through what would happen at the hearing, explaining that a judge would review all the evidence and decide where I'd live while the investigation continued. She was very clear that the judge would make decisions based on safety, not on keeping families together just because that's what society thinks should happen. If going home wasn't safe, I wouldn't go home, period. The hearing was scheduled for the next week, and Elise would be there along with Kamala and Detective Buckley to present the case. That afternoon, Mom tried to get into my hospital room again, and this time security didn't just turn her away. They issued a formal trespass warning, telling her that any further attempt to access my room would result in her arrest. The security guard who delivered the warning wrote up a detailed incident report and gave a copy to Detective Buckley, adding another piece of documentation to the growing file about Mom's inability to respect boundaries. I watched through the small window in my door as the guard walked Mom back to the elevators, and her face was red with rage the whole way down the hall. My phone buzzed with a voicemail notification 20 minutes later, and I knew it was Mom before I even checked. I saved the message immediately, and then played it on speaker for Elise. Mom's voice came through tight and controlled, the kind of calm that meant she was absolutely furious. She said I was destroying the family legacy that 5 generations of men had built through sacrifice and dedication. She said I'd regret betraying our traditions and turning my back on everything that made our family special. The explicit threat in her tone made my hands shake, but I forwarded the recording to both Detective Buckley and Elise right away. Elise nodded and made notes, saying the voicemail would strengthen the case for a permanent no-contact order. Elise came back to my room and sat down on the edge of my bed instead of in the chair. She looked at me directly and said something I'd been too afraid to ask about. I would not be going home tonight or any night until the court determined it was safe, which might mean never going back at all. The mix of feelings that hit me was so intense I couldn't find words. Grief for the family I'd wanted and never had. Relief that I wouldn't have to face Mom and that 12-in corset. Fear about what came next, and guilt about leaving Dad and my brothers behind. I couldn't speak, so I just nodded while tears ran down my face, and Elise sat there quietly until I was done crying. Late that night, my phone rang with Dad's number, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Dad's voice came through as a whisper, like he was hiding in a closet or bathroom to make the call. He said he knew what Mom did was wrong, and he was sorry he hadn't protected us. He said he didn't know how to leave or how to survive on his own after 20 years of being controlled. I told him I loved him, but I couldn't come back, that I'd die if I went home, and he had to know that was true. I said he needed to choose between protecting his sons and staying with Mom because he couldn't do both anymore. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought he'd hung up, but then he whispered, "Okay," and the call ended. The next morning, Kamala showed up with coffee and a folder full of papers about court procedures. She explained the layout of the courtroom and who would be fully present at the hearing, walking me through exactly what would happen from the moment I arrived until the judge made a decision. We practiced breathing exercises I could use if I started panicking, and I was amazed at how much air my lungs could actually hold when they weren't being crushed down to nothing. Kamala had me take slow breaths in through my nose and out through my mouth, counting to 4 each time, and my chest expanded further than it had in 10 years. The simple act of breathing fully felt like a miracle and a reminder of everything I'd been denied. The morning of the emergency hearing arrived 3 days after my hospital discharge, and I dressed in clothes Kamala brought me, regular jeans and a loose shirt that didn't squeeze anything. The courthouse felt massive and cold as we walked through security, metal detectors beeping while guards checked bags and waved people through. Elise met us in the hallway outside the courtroom and ran through what would happen, who would speak, where I'd sit. The judge would review evidence packets that included my audio recording, Dr. Ramirez's medical reports, the hospital photos showing my crushed rib cage, and Detective Buckley's documentation of Mom's repeated boundary violations at the hospital. I nodded along, but my hands were shaking, so Kamala had me do the breathing exercises right there in the hallway, slow counts of 4 while people in suits walked past us. Inside the courtroom, Mom sat at a table with her lawyer, wearing a nice blouse, like this was a job interview instead of a hearing about whether she'd destroyed her sons. Dad wasn't there because Elise said he'd been interviewed separately, and his testimony was already part of the record. The judge was a woman maybe 50 years old with gray hair pulled back tight, and she spent 20 minutes reading through the evidence file while everyone sat in silence. She played my audio recording on the courtroom speakers, and Mom's voice filled the space talking about sacrifice and the 12-in corset and how I was the last hope for the family legacy. Hearing it played back in that official setting made it sound even more insane than it had felt living through it. The judge's face stayed neutral, but her jaw got tighter as the recording continued. When it finished, she asked Mom's lawyer if he had any statement, and the lawyer said something about cultural practices and family traditions, words that tried to make torture sound respectable. The judge cut him off mid-sentence and said that regardless of cultural context, the medical evidence showed severe physical harm to multiple minors and ongoing danger. She granted temporary custody to the state for both me and Elias, declared us dependent children under CPS protection, and issued a no-contact order prohibiting Mom from any communication or approach within 500 FT of either of us. The order was effective immediately, and violations would result in arrest. Mom's lawyer started to object, but the judge said her ruling was final and court was adjourned. Mom turned in her chair and stared directly at me across the courtroom, her eyes promising that this wasn't really over, that she'd find some way to finish what she started with that ivory corset. The look said I'd betrayed everything that mattered, and she'd make me understand eventually. For 10 years, that stare would have made me fold, made me apologize, made me accept whatever she wanted, but something had shifted when the corset came off, and I stared back without looking away, meeting her eyes until she was the one who finally turned toward her lawyer. The invisible tether between us stretched thinner, not broken completely, but definitely damaged. Elise touched my shoulder and said we needed to leave through the side exit where a CPS transport van was waiting. I followed her and Kamala down a hallway that smelled like floor cleaner and out a door that led to the parking lot. The van was white with county logos on the side, and a woman driver nodded at us as we climbed in. The whole ride took maybe 20 minutes through streets I recognized from living here my whole life, except now I was seeing them from the wrong side, the side where you're going to a shelter instead of going home. The domestic violence shelter sat behind a tall fence with cameras pointed at the gate, security designed to keep dangerous people out. Staff met us at the door and walked me through orientation, explaining rules about curfew and chores and mandatory meetings. They showed me the common areas, including a kitchen where residents could cook, a TV room with worn couches, and a little office where advocates worked. My room was on the second floor, small and plain with white walls and a twin bed pushed against the window. The bed was flat, completely horizontal, something I hadn't been able to use in years because the corset made lying down impossible. I'd been sleeping propped up on pillows in a half-sitting position since I was 8. The staff member showing me around pointed out the closet and bathroom and said dinner was at 6 o'clock in the dining room downstairs. She left, and I sat on the edge of the bed running my hand over the flat mattress. The whole situation felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life instead of living my own. I had a drawer for clothes, a lamp on the nightstand, a door that locked from the inside. Everything was basic and institutional, but it was mine and nobody could walk in whenever they wanted to tighten laces or measure my waist. That first night, I lay flat on my back, staring at the ceiling, and my body kept panicking because the crushing pressure wasn't there. 10 years of constant compression had trained my nervous system to expect that feeling, and the absence triggered its own kind of alarm. My ribs felt too loose. My organs felt like they were floating wrong. My spine didn't know what to do without steel bones forcing it into position. I'd start to drift towards sleep, and then jerk awake gasping because my body thought something was wrong. Around midnight, I gave up on sleeping and sat on the floor doing the breathing exercises Kamala taught me, counting to 4 on the inhale and 4 on the exhale, focusing on the full expansion of my lungs. I did that for maybe 2 hours, until my body finally accepted lack of pain was real and safe. Exhaustion won around 3 in the morning, and I passed out on top of the covers, still dressed, too tired to panic anymore. The next few days blurred together in a series of medical appointments that Elise coordinated through CPS. A physical therapist examined how my spine had curved and my ribs had overlapped, taking measurements and photos while explaining that some damage might be permanent, but targeted exercises could help. A gastroenterologist did an endoscopy to see how badly my stomach and intestines were compressed, saying I'd need to relearn how to eat normal portions because my digestive system had shrunk. A pulmonologist tested my lung capacity and found it was about 60% of what it should be for my age and size, but that might improve now that my rib cage could expand. Each specialist developed a care plan with specific goals and timelines, writing everything down in official medical language. I signed releases at every appointment, allowing them to share records with CPS and the court, building this huge file that documented exactly what 10 years of corset training had done to my body. The medical evidence kept stacking up, each report adding another layer of proof that what Mom did wasn't discipline or tradition. It was systematic destruction. Detective Buckley executed a search warrant at the house while I was at my pulmonology appointment. Elise called to tell me about it afterward, saying they'd collected the 12-in ivory corset, all the locked training devices from my room, and journals dating back generations that documented the family's waist training tradition. The physical evidence got photographed and cataloged at the police station, each piece treated as part of the abuse case. The antique corset that Mom held up like a prize was now sitting in an evidence locker labeled as the weapon it was intended to be. Buckley also found measurement charts Mom kept tracking each son's waist circumference over the years, showing the progression from normal childhood measurements to the extreme compression we'd achieved. The documentation was meticulous, almost proud, like Mom thought she was preserving important family records instead of proof of abuse. Elise brought copies of some journal excerpts to show me during our next meeting, and reading them made me understand how deep this pattern went. Great-great-grandfather wrote about enduring the pain as proof of his dedication to beauty and family standards. Great-grandfather described his own son's training with pride, noting how quickly he adapted to smaller measurements. Grandfather documented Dad's training and wedding preparation, including detailed notes about achieving 18 inches before the ceremony. The suffering was normalized across generations, each man writing about it like it was an accomplishment instead of torture. The cycle became so clear in those pages, fathers inflicting on sons what had been inflicted on them, framing it as love and tradition instead of trauma. My anger expanded beyond just Mom to include all the men who suffered and then made their sons suffer too, who could have broken the pattern but chose to continue it instead. I asked Elise if I could keep copies of some pages, and she said yes, that seeing the full scope might help me process what happened. 6 days after my collapse in the grocery store, Elise got a call that Victor had agreed to be medically evaluated. His fiancée broke off the engagement after learning about the abuse investigation, saying she couldn't marry into a family with this kind of scandal. Without the wedding to prepare for, Victor chose breathing over reputation and checked himself into treatment for his failing liver. The hospital admitted him immediately because his liver enzymes were critically elevated and his skin had turned yellow from jaundice. Elise arranged for an advocate to visit Victor and explain his options, including safe housing and legal support, planting seeds for longer-term recovery beyond just the immediate medical crisis. I wanted to visit, but Elise said Victor needed space to make his own choices without family pressure, that the best thing I could do was focus on my own healing and let my brother figure out his path. 2 weeks after the emergency hearing, I had a supervised meeting with Dad at the CPS office. He sat across from me at a conference table with Elise present, crying and saying he blamed himself for not being stronger, for not protecting us. He explained that Mom's own father raised her with these beliefs, that her grandfather had achieved 16 inches and was celebrated in the family as the standard of beauty. Mom truly thought she was preserving something valuable, carrying on a legacy that made our family special. Dad's voice shook as he described 20 years of living in that house, of having his body crushed and his will broken until he couldn't imagine any other way to exist. I listened without interrupting, and when he finished, I said clearly that I loved Dad, but I loved being alive more. I told him I would not be coming home, not now and maybe not ever, and that he needed to choose between protecting his sons and staying with Mom because he couldn't do both anymore. The boundary felt harsh saying it out loud, but Kamala had helped me practice this conversation, reminding me that setting limits wasn't cruel, it was necessary. Dad nodded and wiped his eyes and said he understood, that he'd start looking into his options for leaving. 3 weeks after my rescue, the school administration reached out through Kamala to discuss accommodations for my eventual return. They wanted to arrange extended deadlines, excused absences for medical appointments, and permission to leave class if I felt overwhelmed, but Kamala warned me that gossip had already spread among students and staff, that people were talking about what happened and speculating about details they didn't actually know. The exposure exhaustion hit me hard as I realized my private trauma was now public knowledge, that I'd be walking into school with everyone knowing some version of my story. I told Kamala I didn't think I could handle that, and she reminded me that visibility also meant safety, that mom couldn't hurt me in secret anymore because too many people were watching. The publicity that felt awful was also protection, witnesses who would notice if anything seemed wrong. I agreed to start back part-time after another 2 weeks, giving myself space to adjust before facing the public scrutiny that came with being the boy whose mom tried to crush him to death. A few days later, Detective Buckley sat down with Dad in a different room at the CPS office, just the two of them with a recording device on the table between them. Elise told me about it afterwards because I wasn't allowed to be there. Said Dad talked for almost 2 hours about Mom's family and how she grew up. Turns out Mom's own father wore corsets his whole life and got down to 16 inches, and his grandfather before him achieved even smaller measurements that the family kept records of like some kind of sick achievement chart. Dad explained that Mom truly believed she was protecting an important tradition, that she saw the waist training as cultural heritage passed down through generations of men in her family line. The way Detective Buckley wrote it up in his report, Mom's motivation came from a multi-generational trauma, where each generation taught the next that beauty meant suffering and family pride meant continuing the practice no matter what. It didn't make what she did any less harmful or wrong, but it showed her beliefs weren't just random sadism, they were rooted in this twisted family legacy that had been crushing men for over a century. Detective Buckley documented everything Dad said about Mom's childhood, how her father praised her for understanding beauty standards, and how her mother expected her to find a husband who would maintain the tradition. The complexity got recorded in official reports, creating a fuller picture of why Mom did what she did, even though the harm to me and my brothers stayed exactly the same regardless of her reasons. 2 weeks after the emergency hearing, Elise called me at the shelter and said the DA wanted to meet about the case direction. We sat in a small conference room at the courthouse, and the DA explained that Mom's lawyer was pushing for a plea deal to lesser charges. The offer would be reduced counts of child endangerment instead of attempted murder, but in exchange, Mom would have to accept a no-contact order that lasted years and agree to jail time plus extended probation with mandatory counseling. Elise walked me through what it meant, speaking slowly so I understood every part. She said a plea deal gave us certainty of protection because the terms would be locked in and enforceable right away, versus going to trial where outcomes were less predictable and could take months or even years to resolve. The DA might push for harsher charges at trial, but there was also risk that a jury might not fully understand the severity or that legal technicalities could result in lighter consequences. I asked what she thought I should do, and Elise said it wasn't really my choice alone that the DA would make the final call, but my input mattered, and she wanted me to understand the trade-offs. The guaranteed distance from Mom felt more important than gambling on a trial that might not give us better results, and the combination of jail time and probation meant Mom would face real consequences even if they weren't the maximum possible. I told the DA I could live with the plea deal if it meant Mom couldn't come near me or my brothers, and Elise squeezed my hand under the table. 3 days later, Elias got released from the hospital to a medical foster home where nurses could keep checking on his healing lung. CPS arranged a supervised visit for me to see him, and I rode there with Elise in her car, feeling my stomach twist into knots. The foster home was this regular house in a suburb with a living room full of medical equipment and a nurse who checked Elias's vitals every few hours. Elias sat on a couch with pillows propped around him, still moving carefully because his ribs hurt, and when he saw me, his face went hard and angry. He started yelling before I even sat down, saying I destroyed everything and broke the family apart and ruined his life by calling for help. His words came fast and mean, accusing me of being selfish and not understanding that Mom was just trying to help us be beautiful, like the men in our family always were. I didn't defend myself or argue back, just sat in the chair across from him and let his rage pour out while the foster mom and Elise watched from the doorway. Elias said I should have kept quiet and dealt with it like Victor and Dad did, that now everyone at the school knew our private family business and he could never show his face again. I held space for his feelings without taking on blame for Mom's choices, letting him be angry and hurt without trying to fix it or make him understand right away. After maybe 20 minutes, he ran out of steam and just sat there breathing hard, tears running down his face, and I said quietly that I was sorry he was hurting, but I wasn't sorry for surviving. Before I left the visit, I pulled out a card Kamala had given me with the advocate's contact information printed on it. I set it on the coffee table between us and told Elias I would be here whenever he was ready to talk, that I wasn't going anywhere, and the door was always open when he wanted to reach out. I didn't demand that he forgive me or understand right away, just planted those seeds of connection and left them there for him to pick up if and when he was ready. The foster mom walked me to the door and said Elias was doing okay physically, but struggling emotionally, which made sense given everything he'd been through. On the drive back to the shelter, Kamala called my phone and Elise put her on speaker. Kamala had heard about the visit from the CPS notes, and she told me that leaving the door open while still maintaining my boundaries showed real growth in understanding healthy relationships. She said a lot of abuse survivors either cut people off completely or let them back in without limits. But I was finding this middle path of staying available without compromising my own safety. The feedback made me feel like maybe I was learning how to do this right, how to protect myself while not giving up on my brother completely. That evening at the shelter, there was a support group meeting in the common room, and I'd been avoiding it for weeks because the idea of talking about what happened made my throat close up. But the shelter coordinator kept encouraging me to try it, saying other survivors found it helpful to share their stories with people who understood. I sat in the circle of folding chairs with maybe 8 other people ages, ranging from teenagers to someone's grandpa, and when it was my turn, I forced myself to start talking. I described the corsets and the training, and my brother's damaged bodies, speaking in this flat voice that didn't sound like mine. The words came easier than I expected once I started, and nobody interrupted or looked shocked. They just listened and nodded like they'd heard similar things before. After I finished, other people shared their own experiences of different types of abuse, and I started understanding that what happened to me fit this larger pattern of control and harm that showed up in lots of forms. One man talked about being locked in closets, another about having his food restricted until he was hospitalized, a third about being forced to exercise until he collapsed. The methods were different, but the underlying pattern was the same. Someone with power using that power to hurt and control someone more vulnerable. The solidarity of being believed and understood by people who'd lived through their own trauma made my experience feel survivable instead of isolating. For the first time since this all started, I didn't feel like the only person this had ever happened to. Didn't feel like some kind of freak with a uniquely horrible story. These people got it without me having to explain or justify, and that understanding wrapped around me like the first real safety I'd felt in years. 10 days after the no contact order got issued, my phone buzzed with texts from Dad's number, but the messages weren't from him. Mom had grabbed his phone and sent me 3 long texts about family loyalty and tradition, about how I was destroying generations of heritage and breaking sacred bonds that held our family together. She said I was being selfish and ungrateful, that everything she did was for my own good, and someday I'd understand and regret turning against her. I read the messages with shaking hands and immediately took screenshots of everything, then forwarded them to Detective Buckley's email with a note about the date and time. Detective Buckley called me back within an hour and said this was a clear violation of the court order, that Mom wasn't allowed to contact me through any means, including using someone else's phone. The violation got documented as official evidence that Mom couldn't comply with court orders even when her freedom depended on it. Detective Buckley said he'd file a report with the court and the DA, and this would strengthen the case that Mom needed serious consequences because she refused to respect boundaries. I asked if Dad would get in trouble for letting Mom use his phone, and Detective Buckley said probably not, since he likely didn't have much choice. But CPS would need to address it in terms of his ability to protect us. The messages got saved as exhibits in the case file, more proof that Mom saw rules as things that didn't apply to her. A week later, Elise sat down with Dad and me together at the CPS office to talk about what came next. She explained that there was a potential path for Dad to reunify with me and Elias if he was willing to make some major changes. The conditions were clear and specific, not vague promises, but measurable actions. Dad would need to separate from Mom by getting his own housing away from her, attend therapy twice a week to address his role in the abuse, and show consistent compliance with safety planning, including not allowing Mom any access to information about me or my brothers. Elise laid it all out in writing with deadlines and benchmarks, giving Dad a concrete roadmap if he chose to take it. The requirements included Dad getting a job or benefits to support himself, completing a parenting class focused on child safety, and having regular check-ins with CPS to show he was following through. If Dad did all of that and demonstrated over several months that he could prioritize protecting his sons over staying loyal to Mom, then supervised visits could gradually increase and maybe eventually lead to some kind of relationship. Elise was careful to say this wasn't guaranteed and would depend on Dad's actual choices and behaviors, not just his words or promises. Dad sat there crying and nodding, saying he wanted to try, that he was ready to leave Mom and start over. I didn't fully believe him yet because words were easy and actions were hard, but I appreciated that CPS was at least giving him a chance to prove himself instead of just writing him off completely. The next afternoon, Kamala met with Dad at a different office to help him apply for domestic violence housing assistance and benefits. I wasn't there, but Kamala told me about it later, said she walked Dad through pages of paperwork and connected him with resources specifically for people leaving abusive relationships. There were programs that could help with rent deposits, furniture, job training, all the practical stuff that made leaving feel possible instead of impossible. Dad's resistance started softening as he realized that leaving didn't mean being alone or ending up homeless and broke, that there were actual systems designed to support this exact transition. Kamala gave Dad a folder full of information about support groups, legal aid, financial assistance, and counseling services. She explained each resource carefully and helped Dad make a list of next steps with specific phone numbers and deadlines. By the end of the meeting, Dad had applications filled out for 3 different housing programs and appointments scheduled with a therapist and a benefits coordinator. Kamala said Dad seemed overwhelmed, but also kind of hopeful, like maybe he was starting to see a path forward that didn't involve staying trapped with Mom forever. I wanted to believe Dad would follow through, but I also knew that wanting to change and actually changing were two different things. So I kept my expectations low and my boundaries firm. A few days after that, I spent a whole afternoon at the police station with Detective Buckley going through my memories to create a detailed timeline of everything that happened. We sat in a conference room with a big whiteboard, and Detective Buckley wrote dates and events while I talked through 10 years of abuse in chronological order, starting with my 8th birthday and the first corset, then tracking the progression through different devices and tightening sessions, documenting every hospital visit and school incident and family event that showed the escalation. Detective Buckley asked specific questions about dates and locations and who was present, building a clear story that showed how the abuse got worse over time, from initial training to life-threatening danger. The process of organizing everything into a timeline gave me this weird sense of control, like I was helping build the case instead of just being a victim. Seeing it all laid out on the whiteboard made the pattern obvious, how Mom kept pushing further and further until my brother's body started breaking down, and she still didn't stop. Detective Buckley took photos of the timeline and typed everything into a formal report that would be part of the permanent case file. He said having this level of detail would make it much harder for Mom to claim anything was accidental or that she didn't understand the harm she was causing. By the time we finished, my throat was sore from talking and my head hurt from remembering, but the timeline existed now as proof of exactly what happened and when. That same week, the hospital's risk management team held a meeting to review my case and figure out what went wrong with their reporting systems. Elise got a copy of their findings and shared the main points with me. The team identified multiple times when signs of abuse were noted by different staff, but never properly followed up or reported to authorities. The school nurse's documentation of my collapses, the ER visit when I was 13 for dehydration, the orthopedist who saw my curved spine and suspected something was off, all these moments where someone noticed, but the information never got connected into a complete picture. The hospital updated their protocols for recognizing and reporting abuse, creating new requirements for mandatory reporting training and better systems for tracking concerning patterns across multiple visits. They also changed policies about parental interference with medical care, making it harder for parents to prevent doctors from examining kids or talking to them privately. I knew it wasn't my responsibility to fix the medical system, and these changes couldn't undo what happened to me, but knowing that future kids might get identified and helped earlier because of my case provided some bitter validation. Maybe the next boy who showed up with crushed ribs and breathing problems would get rescued before his body was permanently damaged. Maybe some doctor would recognize the pattern faster because they'd been trained on cases like mine. It didn't make my suffering worth it exactly, but at least something useful came out of all this pain besides just my own survival. The DA's office sent paperwork about the possibility of trial if the plea deal fell through, so I needed to prepare a victim impact statement just in case. Kamala brought over a laptop and a template that outlined what judges want to hear, focusing on facts instead of feelings. I sat at the small desk in my shelter room and typed out everything in plain terms, listing the dates I started training, the medical complications that showed up over the years, the specific injuries to me and my brothers. Writing it all down in numbered points made the pattern obvious in a way that felt powerful, like I was building evidence instead of just crying about what happened. When I finished the draft, Kamala had me practice reading it out loud, but my voice kept shaking and my hands went numb halfway through. She taught me this technique where I'd pause and name 5 things I could see in the room, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, 1 thing I could taste. The grounding exercise pulled me back from the edge of panic and let me finish reading without completely falling apart. We practiced it over and over until I could get through the whole statement without my vision going spotty or my breathing getting too shallow. Kamala said the goal wasn't to read it without feeling anything, just to stay present enough to get the words out if I needed to testify. Around week 3, the night terrors started hitting me hard, waking up gasping because I'd been dreaming about Mom pulling the laces tighter and tighter while I couldn't move or scream. The worst ones were when I dreamed about the 12-in ivory corset, feeling it close around me like a trap I couldn't escape, and I'd wake up clawing at my ribs even though the steel was gone. My roommate at the shelter complained to staff about my screaming, so Kamala came over early one morning to teach me more grounding techniques I could use in the middle of the night. She had me practice the 5 senses exercise in bed with my eyes closed, walking through each sense slowly until my heartbeat calmed down. I started keeping a small bag of strong mints on my nightstand because the sharp taste was the fastest way to snap me back to the present when the flashbacks hit. Every night before sleep, I'd run through the grounding steps as practice, training my brain to automatically reach for those tools instead of spiraling into panic. The terrors didn't stop completely, but I learned to manage them faster, cutting the recovery time from an hour down to maybe 15 minutes of focused breathing and sensory awareness. Detective Buckley called to say that Victor had agreed to sign medical releases and let them photograph him for evidence documentation, which was huge because he'd been refusing all cooperation up until now. Apparently, his fiancée had broken off the engagement after learning about the investigation, and without the wedding to prepare for, he decided breathing mattered more than reputation. I got his number from Elise and called him that evening, my hands shaking as I waited for him to pick up. His voice sounded weak and raspy when he answered, and we both just breathed into the phone for a few seconds before either of us could speak. He told me he was sorry for not protecting me, that he should have done something years ago when he saw what Mom was doing. I told him we were all just trying to survive, that I didn't blame him for being trapped the way I was. We didn't talk long because he got tired easily, but before hanging up, he said he was glad I got out and that maybe now he could start healing too. The conversation felt like this small crack opening in the wall between us. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that we'd both been drowning and neither of us could save the other until we saved ourselves first. A few days later, Elise showed up at the shelter with news that Dad had taken a major step by turning over his house keys and several boxes of old family photos to CPS. The photos documented generations of men in corsets, visual proof of the family tradition Mom had been so obsessed with preserving. Dad had physically separated from Mom by moving into his brother's place, which Elise said was significant because it showed active participation in the investigation rather than just passive acceptance. Elise explained that Dad choosing to hand over evidence and break from Mom meant he was prioritizing his sons over his marriage, finally making a choice after 20 years of staying silent. The keys meant Dad was giving up access to the house where all the abuse happened, cutting himself off from Mom's control in a concrete way. Elise kept emphasizing how important this moment was because Dad was doing something instead of just letting things happen to him, showing the court he was capable of protecting us if given the chance. 3 weeks after my collapse in the grocery store, the plea hearing finally arrived. Kamala drove me to the courthouse and walked me through security, staying close as we found seats in the courtroom. Mom sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, her lawyer beside her shuffling papers. The judge reviewed all the evidence, including my audio recording, the medical reports showing the damage to all three of us, and the documentation of Mom's attempts to violate the protective order. Mom's lawyer stood up and entered a guilty plea to felony child endangerment and assault charges, his voice flat and professional. The judge asked Mom directly if she understood what she was pleading guilty to, and if anyone had forced or threatened her to take the plea. Mom said yes in this tight voice, her jaw clenched like the words were being pulled out of her against her will. The sentencing came next, 18 months in county jail followed by 5 years of probation with mandatory counseling. The judge also issued a permanent no-contact order that would prevent Mom from any communication with me, Elias, or Victor without explicit court approval. Mom stared straight ahead during the whole thing, not looking at anyone, her hands folded on the table in front of her. When the judge dismissed the court, Mom finally turned and looked directly at me, and I forced myself to hold her gaze without flinching or looking away. After we left the courtroom, I sat in Kamala's car feeling this weird mix of relief and frustration churning in my stomach. Elise met us in the parking lot and explained that while 18 months wasn't the maximum sentence the DA could have pushed for, it guaranteed a conviction that would follow Mom forever. I told Elise it felt wrong, that decades of suffering only resulted in a year and a half behind bars, that the math didn't add up. She reminded me that imperfect justice is still justice, that the no-contact order and probation terms meant real protection even if the jail time felt too short. The outcome gave me legal safety, even if it didn't give me the satisfaction of seeing Mom punished proportionally to the harm she caused. What mattered was that she couldn't reach me anymore, couldn't finish what she'd started with that 12-in corset, couldn't hurt any of us again without immediate consequences. Over the next week, CPS moved forward with placing Elias back with Dad under strict compliance monitoring, with conditions that Dad had to maintain his separate housing and attend all required therapy sessions. A caseworker would be doing regular home visits to make sure Dad was following through and that Elias was safe. Victor enrolled in an outpatient medical program specifically for liver damage, starting the long process of healing his body while living in transitional housing for young adults. The program included both medical treatment and counseling to help him rebuild his life outside of Mom's control. Elise gave me updates on both my brothers during our weekly check-ins, and hearing that they were getting help eased some of the guilt I'd been carrying about whether my collapse had destroyed the family or saved it. 4 weeks after leaving home, I started attending school part-time with a bunch of accommodations the administration had arranged through Kamala's advocacy. I could turn in assignments late without penalty, skip class for medical appointments without it counting against me, and leave anytime I felt overwhelmed. Walking into the building that first day felt surreal, like I was playing at being a normal teenager when everything about my life was completely abnormal. Teachers who knew what happened gave me these careful looks full of pity, while other students whispered and stared as I walked down the hallways. The routine of homework and lectures provided this weird comfort, giving me something to focus on besides trauma and legal proceedings. But sitting in class, taking notes about algebra or history, felt disconnected from reality, like I was watching someone else live a regular life while I was still processing everything that had happened. Rumors had spread through school about my disappearance and the investigation, and people kept approaching me with invasive questions disguised as concern. Kids I barely knew would ask what happened or why I'd been gone, acting like they deserved details about my private trauma. I worked with Kamala to develop a simple script I could use to shut down the questions without being rude. I'd tell people it was a private family matter being handled through appropriate channels, then redirect the conversation to something else like homework or weekend plans. Teachers were sometimes worse than students, pulling me aside after class to ask if I was okay or if I needed to talk, their concern feeling more like curiosity than actual support. I practiced setting firm boundaries with everyone, learning to say no to questions I didn't want to answer, and walking away from conversations that made me uncomfortable. The boundary setting was exhausting, but necessary, protecting my energy for actual healing instead of performing my trauma for people who just wanted the story. Physical therapy sessions twice a week were painful in a different way, stretching and strengthening exercises that targeted the damage from years of compression. The therapist measured my ribcage expansion and spinal flexibility at each session, tracking small improvements that added up over time. My ribs were slowly starting to reshape as the pressure was removed, creating more space for my lungs and organs. My spine was responding to targeted exercises that worked to correct the unnatural curve that had developed. Some days the progress felt impossible to see, just pain and effort without visible results. But the therapist kept showing me the measurements proving that my body was healing, that the changes were real, even when I couldn't feel them yet. Then one day, about 6 weeks into treatment, I took a full deep breath during an exercise and realized there was no restriction, no crushing pressure stopping my lungs from filling completely. I started crying right there in the PT's office because I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without fighting for every bit of air. The therapist let me sit there and just breathe for a few minutes, taking these huge gulps of oxygen that my body had been denied for 10 years. That one full breath felt like proof that my body could recover, that I wasn't permanently broken, that freedom from the corset meant freedom to heal. 6 weeks after the plea hearing, Dad signed the paperwork for a domestic violence housing unit across town, and CPS scheduled the first supervised visit at their office. I sat in a conference room with Elias, while a caseworker positioned herself near the door with a clipboard, and Dad arrived 10 minutes late looking thinner than I remembered. He sat across the table from us and folded his hands in that familiar way, except his waist wasn't crushed anymore, and he could actually breathe while sitting. The visit lasted 45 minutes of careful conversation, where we talked about school and the weather and Elias's physical therapy appointments, avoiding any mention of Mom or the trial or what happened in that study. The caseworker interrupted twice to redirect when Dad started asking questions about whether we missed home, reminding him that certain topics were off limits per the reunification plan. Dad nodded and switched to asking about my medical appointments instead, and I gave short answers about the gastroenterologist and the orthopedist without sharing details that felt too personal. Elias barely spoke during that first visit, just sat there picking at his fingernails and giving one-word responses when Dad asked direct questions. When the 45 minutes ended, the caseworker stood up and explained that the next visit would be scheduled in 2 weeks if Dad maintained compliance with all the requirements, including his own therapy sessions and housing stability. Dad hugged us both carefully at the door, and I felt how different his body was without the corset, how he could actually bend forward a little bit, how his ribs weren't pressing into me like steel bars. The third supervised visit happened on a Tuesday afternoon, and Elias showed up looking like he'd been crying. He sat down next to me instead of across the table after his therapist helped him understand some things he needed to say. The caseworker adjusted her position to give us a bit more space while still maintaining supervision, and Elias turned to face me directly. He said he was sorry for blaming me and calling me a family destroyer, that his therapist explained how I didn't break anything that wasn't already broken by what Mom did to all of us. His voice cracked on the word sorry, but he kept going, saying he was angry at the wrong person, and he knew that now, even though it was hard to admit. I told him I understood being angry, and that I didn't expect us to be close right away, that we could just try to keep showing up to these visits and therapy and see what happened. Elias nodded and wiped his eyes with his sleeve, and we agreed to continue family therapy together without making promises about becoming best friends or having some perfect brother relationship. The caseworker made notes on her clipboard and asked if we wanted to talk about anything else, but we both just shook our heads. Dad arrived late again, and the caseworker had to document the tardiness as a compliance issue, explaining that showing up on time was one of the basic requirements for reunification. The rest of the visit was less tense, with Elias not glaring at me, and we even talked a little bit about a show we both watched. Victor called me on a Thursday night while I was doing homework at the shelter. He said his liver function test came back better than the doctors expected, and they were talking about him maybe not needing a transplant if he continued improving. His voice sounded stronger than the last time we talked, less like he was drowning in his own body. He told me he canceled the wedding completely, not rescheduled it, just ended the whole thing because he realized he didn't even know who he was, without trying to achieve some waist measurement. His ex-fiancée had already moved on anyway, which he said was fine because he needed to figure out what he actually wanted instead of just following the script Mom wrote for his life. I asked how he was doing with the not wearing a corset thing, and he laughed, this surprised sound like he forgot he could laugh freely. He said that learning to just breathe and take up space without apologizing was harder than he expected, that he kept catching himself trying to make himself smaller in rooms or when walking past people. But his therapist was helping him practice just existing at his normal size without that constant pressure to shrink down. He told me he was proud of me for getting us all out, for being brave enough to collapse in that grocery store and start the whole intervention process. I didn't feel particularly brave, just desperate, but I thanked him anyway. We talked for almost an hour about nothing important, just brother stuff about TV shows and what foods he could finally eat now that his stomach wasn't crushed flat. Before hanging up, he said this was the first time in his life he was just breathing without it being a fight, and that freedom was worth more than any tuxedo or family legacy. 8 weeks after my collapse, Detective Buckley called and asked if I could come to the police station to pick up copies of my statement and the evidence photos. Kamala drove me there on a Saturday morning, and we met him in a small office where he had everything organized in a large envelope. He explained that the criminal case was complete now with Mom's guilty plea, and the original evidence would stay in police custody, but I could have copies for my own records if I wanted them. I took the envelope and held it in my lap, feeling the weight of all those documents and photos that proved what happened. Detective Buckley said the case file was moving to archive, which meant it would be stored securely, but wouldn't be actively worked anymore since the prosecution was finished. He shook my hand and told me I did a brave thing by speaking up and following through with the investigation, that a lot of victims don't make it this far in the process. The meeting felt like an ending, even though I knew the actual effects of what happened would keep going for years. Kamala and I sat in her car in the parking lot afterward, and I stared at the envelope, not sure if I wanted to open it and look at the evidence photos or just keep it sealed. She said I didn't have to decide right now, that I could put it away and look at it later if I ever needed proof or wanted to remember exactly what happened. I took the envelope into my backpack, and we drove back to the shelter without talking much, just listening to the radio and letting the closure settle in. The CPS caseworker arranged for me to return to the house one time to collect my essential belongings, and she drove me there on a Wednesday afternoon when she knew Mom was in jail and Dad was at his housing unit. We pulled up to the house, and it looked smaller than I remembered, less powerful somehow now that I wasn't trapped inside it. The caseworker unlocked the door with keys Dad had turned over, and we walked through rooms that felt like they belonged to a different life. My bedroom looked exactly the same. Bed made tight with the blue comforter I'd had since I was 12, desk organized with school supplies, closet full of clothes that mostly didn't fit anymore because my body had changed so much without the corset. I grabbed my laptop and charger first, then started pulling clothes off hangers and stuffing them into garbage bags the caseworker had brought. I took my books from the shelf, my photos from the bulletin board, the stuffed bear Dad gave me when I was little. The caseworker asked if I wanted to go into Mom's study to get anything, and I said absolutely not, that there was nothing in that room I ever wanted to see again. We loaded everything into her car in 3 trips, and I walked through the house one last time, looking at the kitchen where we'd eaten those silent dinners, the living room where Victor used to sit dying on the couch, the bathroom where I'd locked myself in to plan my grocery store collapse. I walked out the front door and didn't look back, leaving behind the study and the training equipment and all the years of suffering that happened inside those walls. The caseworker locked the door and returned the keys to her pocket, and we drove away while I watched the house get smaller in the side mirror until we turned the corner and it disappeared. The court scheduled a hearing to finalize the long-term restraining orders, and I didn't have to attend because the DA handled everything without needing my testimony. Kamala called me afterward to explain that the judge approved protective orders extending for 10 years, renewable if needed when they expired. Mom couldn't contact me or Elias or Victor, couldn't come within 500 FT of any of us, couldn't try to reach us through third parties or social media or any other method. The orders were enforceable across state lines if any of us moved, and violations would result in immediate arrest and additional criminal charges. Mom had started her mandated treatment program while serving her jail sentence, meeting with a psychologist twice a week to address whatever beliefs made her think crushing her son's bodies was acceptable. The legal protections felt solid and real, not just words on paper, but actual boundaries with consequences attached. Kamala explained that when Mom eventually got released from jail, she'd still have 5 years of probation with strict conditions, and any violation of the restraining orders or probation terms would send her back to jail immediately. I asked what would happen if she tried to contact us anyway, and she said the orders gave law enforcement clear authority to act, that I could call 911 if she showed up, and police would have to respond and arrest her. The distance between us wasn't just physical space anymore, but legal force, and knowing that made me feel safer than I had in years. I bought a cheap notebook at the dollar store and started keeping a journal to track both my trauma triggers and my small wins. The first entry documented a panic attack I had when someone bumped into me in the hallway at the school, and I felt that old crushing pressure for a split second before realizing it wasn't real. I wrote down what triggered it, how long it lasted, what helped me calm down, trying to find patterns in when the flashbacks hit hardest. But I also wrote about the small victories, like the day I wore a loose t-shirt to the school without feeling feeling exposed or wrong, or when I ate a full meal without my stomach hurting because there was actually room for food now. The journal became this private record of healing that belonged only to me, not to CPS or doctors or lawyers, but just my own documentation of getting better. I wrote about physical therapy progress, about visits with Dad and Elias, about conversations with Victor, about days when I felt normal, and days when the trauma was so heavy I could barely function. Some entries were just lists of things that happened, and other entries were longer processing of feelings I didn't know how to talk about out loud. I kept the journal hidden in my shelter room under my mattress because it contained thoughts too raw to share with anyone. Words about hating Mom and missing her at the same time, about loving Dad and being angry at him for not protecting us, about grief for the childhood I never got to have. Writing it all down made the experiences feel more real and manageable, like I was taking control of my own story instead of just living through events that happened to me. Family therapy sessions with Dad happened every other week in a small office with a therapist who specialized in abuse cases. During the 5th session, Dad finally said out loud that he was complicit in what happened, and that fear kept him silent for 20 years. He talked about being terrified of Mom, of having no money or job skills, of believing he deserved the suffering because that's what he'd been taught since his own training started at 16. The therapist asked what he wished he'd done differently, and Dad started crying, saying he wished he'd been brave enough to leave the first time Mom laced a corset on Victor. I sat there listening and feeling this complicated mix of anger and sadness, understanding his fear, but also knowing that understanding didn't erase the damage. When the therapist asked me to respond, I said clearly that I loved Dad, but I needed him to know that any relationship we had going forward depended on his consistent choices to prioritize safety over loyalty to Mom. We established concrete boundaries about what would happen if Dad wavered, if he tried to excuse Mom's behavior, or suggest reconciliation, or minimize what happened. The therapist wrote everything down and created a formal agreement that Dad had to maintain his separation from Mom, continue his own therapy, show up on time to supervised visits, and never ask us to forgive her or maintain contact with her. Dad signed the agreement and promised he would follow through, that he was choosing us this time, even though it meant losing the life he'd known for decades. I didn't promise to trust him immediately, or to move back in with him, just said I'd keep showing up to therapy and visits and we'd see where it went based on his actions, not his words. 3 months after the grocery store collapse, Detective Buckley contacted me about the ivory corset and asked what I wanted done with it now that the criminal case was finished. He explained that technically it could be returned to the family as property, but given its significance as evidence of the abuse, he wanted to know my preference. I thought about that 12-in torture device sitting in an evidence locker, about how it represented 5 generations of men being crushed into impossible shapes. The idea of it going back to the family as some kind of heirloom made me feel sick, like it would just be waiting to destroy another generation of sons. I told Detective Buckley I wanted to authorize it to be kept permanently as evidence for law enforcement training and advocacy purposes, to be used in teaching other officers and social workers how to recognize this kind of abuse. He said that was possible, and he'd arrange for it to be transferred to a training program where it could help protect other kids. Reframing the object from symbol of family tradition to educational tool felt like taking power away from what it originally meant, turning Mom's weapon into something that would prevent future suffering instead of causing it. I signed the authorization paperwork and felt lighter somehow, knowing that corset would never touch another person's body, but would instead serve as proof that this kind of abuse happens and needs to be stopped. Detective Buckley thanked me and said my decision would help a lot of people, that sometimes the best thing survivors can do is make sure their evidence helps others avoid the same harm. That night in my shelter room, I practiced the slow breathing exercises that had become my evening routine before bed. I lay flat on my back on the narrow mattress and put one hand on my stomach, feeling it rise and fall without any restriction or crushing pressure. I could take these huge, deep breaths that filled my lungs completely, feeling my ribcage expand in all directions instead of being forced into an unnatural shape. The absence of pain had become its own kind of promise that my body belonged to me again, that I got to decide how much space I took up and how deeply I breathed. I bent over and touched my toes, something I hadn't been able to do in 10 years. I twisted to look behind me at the wall, rotating my spine freely without steel bones preventing the movement. I lay on my side and curled into a ball, feeling my body fold naturally instead of being held rigid by locked metal. All these simple movements that most people never think about felt like miracles, like proof that freedom from the corset meant freedom to exist in my body without constantly fighting it. The breathing exercises had become meditation, a way to remind myself every night that I survived and my body was healing, and I had a future that I got to choose. I fell asleep breathing slowly and deeply, my lungs filling completely with air, my ribs expanding naturally, my body finally mine. The next morning I woke up without pain pressing into my ribs and spent 5 minutes just stretching in bed, bending and twisting in ways I couldn't do for 10 years. School started 2 weeks later with half days at first, and I sat through algebra and and English lit without needing to leave class to catch my breath. My locker was on the second floor, and I climbed those stairs without stopping, without the gray spots swimming across my vision that used to hit me halfway up. The kids who knew what happened mostly left me alone, and the ones who didn't just thought I'd been sick for a while. I met with the school counselor every Tuesday to check in, and she helped me figure out which assignments I could handle and which ones needed extensions. Medical appointments filled up Thursdays with the lung doctor checking my breathing capacity, and the stomach doctor monitoring how my digestive system was adjusting to actually having space to work. The physical therapist had me doing exercises to straighten my spine and strengthen the muscles that had been squeezed useless for years, and every week I could bend a little further and stand a little straighter. Family therapy happened on Saturdays at the CPS office with me and Elias sitting across from each other while the therapist asked us questions about trust and hurt and what we needed to feel safe. Elias showed up every week and actually talked instead of just sitting there angry, and by the second month he admitted he was glad I collapsed in that store, even though it felt like betrayal at the time. Dad came to separate sessions where he practiced saying out loud that he should have protected us, that fear wasn't an excuse for letting Mom destroy our bodies. He got his own apartment and kept it clean and showed up on time to every single visit, proving through boring, consistent actions that he meant what he said about choosing us over her. Victor focused on his liver treatment and called me once a week to report that he could take deeper breaths now and his skin wasn't yellow anymore. Support group met Wednesday nights, and I listened to other survivors talk about their different kinds of abuse, realizing that control came in lots of forms, but freedom felt the same for all of us. 4 months after Mom held up that 12-in corset, I sat in my shelter room and took the deepest breath my lungs had ever held, feeling my ribs expand fully without any steel bones stopping them. I wasn't magically healed and probably never would be completely, but I could breathe and move and eat without puking, and that was enough. The grocery store collapse broke the chain that had been crushing our family's men for 5 generations, and now me and my brothers got to figure out who we were when beauty didn't require suffering. We all carried scars on our bodies and probably always would, but we were safer now and learning that taking up space wasn't something to apologize for. That's my side of the story, but I already know half of you see it completely differently, and honestly, that's what makes this fun. Leave your version in the comments, I'll be checking through them later. You always bring something new.